Welcome to On the Mark. I'm your host, Howard Mark Rubin. I am so excited to present this podcast series addressing our rapidly changing world and how it is affecting industries and people in unique and interesting ways. As John F. Kennedy once said, change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future. The business leaders and personalities who I will be interviewing in these podcasts certainly look to the future. And I hope you come away with information and inspiration that helps you adapt in both your business and personal lives. You can find these podcasts on all major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, Platzer.com. Welcome to On the Mark. I'm Howard Mark Rubin, and we have a very special show today. I have a friend of mine who's in a business that's frankly one of my passions, sports collectibles that I've been doing for many years. And I've met Crisafulli, our guest today, through the sports collectible business. I've purchased from him and I've done some business with him. And obviously we've had a good relationship and good dealing since. So Al, welcome to On the Mark.
Thanks for having me, Howard. It's good to see you.
This is where you say, hi, welcome to be here. Okay, great. Okay, so Al, I want to cover a lot of things, but first let's talk about how you got into the sports collectible business. I've kind of always been envious of you, not because you make so much money, but because you're a guy that had a relatively successful advertising agency and decided that he wanted to do what he loved to do, which was sports collectibles, that you actually are not doing this as just a business, it's because what you love to do. And I've always said, and I know a lot of people have said, if you can make a living doing what you love to do, that's a success in life. And that's what you've been able to do. You took a plunge, or took a leap, I should say, went into this business with not a hell of a lot when you started off. It took a lot of guts to do what you did, and you made it go. And so tell us a little about the process of how you got into the sports collectible business and decided to make that plunge.
Sure. Well, so I've been a collector since I was a little boy, and I started an advertising agency. I was involved with sort of a corporate shakeout. I was a director of marketing for a Fortune 1000 energy company, and there was a little shakeout that left me jobless. So I started an ad agency back in 2004, and I did that, and it was fun. And then I sort of turned 40, and you start to get a little bit more of a sense of your own mortality, I think, and I started to reflect a little bit about what I was doing for a living, and how the ad industry is interesting and fun, but everything you do is disposable. You design a website and it's obsolete in 3 years. You do a direct mail campaign and 97% of the people throw it in the garbage, and that's considered a success. And I started to think a little bit about what am I leaving behind, and so I sold my shares of the company, and I thought about it for a while, and I thought, I love this business. I love the history. I love connecting people with things that they're looking for. I love helping folks that, have valuable material in their attics and don't know what to do with it. And so here I am. I started Love of the Game Auctions in May of 2012. So we're on year 13, and it's been a great ride. It's been a lot of fun. I don't want to do anything else.
Well, you do a great job of it, and
well, thank you.
As I said, I'm so envious that you get to do what you love for a living.
It's great. Go on.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the collectible business as an investment because, as you know, the stock market these days is very up and down, depending on what our president happens to say that day. And people are looking for alternative investments. Now, I have a personal experience that I collected baseball cards. I collected full sets, which, by the way, I think was a mistake. I should have just, for investment purposes, you collect just the the most valuable cards graded rather than collecting a full set. The sets are
Yeah.
never as valuable as the cards, but we'll go into that in a minute. But I reached a point where I have three daughters, and none of them had any interest in it, so I wasn't going to leave it to anybody. And I was saying that, in terms of baseball, which is, I know it's not the only area of collectibles that you're involved in, but it's really
Oh
the
yeah.
probably the most significant in of what you're doing, and it's really in the sports collectible in the baseball card business at least. Baseball seems to be the preeminent business, at least
Yeah.
when we're talking about vintage cards. And I reached a point and said, you know what? All these people that love baseball in the 1950s and 60s, they're getting old like me. So is the demand going to remain? And I remember I had a 1951 Bowman Mickey Mantle rookie card, which is real rookie card, as you know, not the
Sure.
1952 Topps, which is a more
Right.
valuable card, but that's a different story. But I had this card and I had some other cards, and I said, you know what? I should really sell my collection because it's not going to go up in value. There's going to be less people that want these cards. And I did this about this was pre-COVID, obviously, and I sold that card and I sold other cards, and I did okay, but it was a mistake because when COVID came and after COVID, the value of these
Yeah.
cards have shot up. Why do you think it is? Since there's less people from that generation who actually remember these players and have the affinity. Why do you think the value of these collectibles are still going up?
So I think um, they have consistently always gone up. It's just been a slower kind of northward trajectory. Um, I totally understood the logic behind, okay, people are starting to age out a little bit. They're starting to get out of this hobby. There are fewer and fewer people who remember seeing Mickey Mantle and whatever. But there's a lot of people who are collecting folks like Ty Cobb. None of those people are here anymore. Who watch Ty Cobb play, and so I've always been sort of a fan of the hobby, and I never really thought the hobby was going away. But when COVID happened, um, it's a completely different hobby now, and I think there were a number of different things. It's kind of a perfect storm of things that happened. First of all, those of us who were fortunate enough to work from home were at full salary, found that the cost of having a job, just going to a place to work every day, is sort of a sunk cost that nobody really thinks about. And now suddenly you don't have wardrobe and lunch and gas and all of those expenses that it takes you to get to work. You have suddenly more money. Then the government's giving you some money, to help you get by, and then on top of that, you can't go anywhere. You're trapped in your house. So all of the things that you spend your disposable income on are gone. You can't go to the movies. You can't go to concerts. You can't go to sporting events. You can't go out to dinner. So essentially, that created boredom and more money. And so I think what happened there was a lot of people went up into their attics and they rediscovered the things that they did when they were kids. So suddenly collectibles became crazy. The demand was insane. I think one of the things that I remember vividly was the when so March of 2020 was when kind of the world shut down, and we had an auction scheduled for early April of 2020. So we were really the first auction house to have an auction after COVID started, really doing its biggest damage. And we had about half of our consigners who were very worried about, what's going to happen to my consignment. Are people going to be spending money on the hobby when they're not even sure if they're going to be alive tomorrow? And how is that going to work? And then the other half are people who said, I just lost my job and I need you to have this auction because this is going to be my only income for I don't know how long. And so ultimately we decided that the only real option was to roll the dice and see. And the auction did incrementally better than we expected that it would. I mean, things went for money that they never had gone for before, and it wound up being, just a phenomenal success. And from there, I mean, we had our first $1 million auction was we're a smaller company, so our first $1 million auction was the second auction that we had after COVID, and everyone since has been a million or greater. And yeah, I mean, the hobby has taken off, and I think part of the reason is because more young people are involved in it, and I think part of the reason is because it's gotten a lot of publicity. But I see no downside. I see no, that risk that we were talking about at the beginning of, people are aging out and they're getting older and they don't remember Mickey Mantle. I think fewer people are collecting for their own nostalgia, and now they're collecting for the investment purpose. And I think that it's got legs. And it's going to be around for a while.
So when you talk about collecting for the investment purposes,
Mm-hmm.
there are graded cards. It used to be a half a dozen or more grading companies. There's really two or three
Yeah.
that are respected in the industry. PSA probably being the preeminent one. But
Yeah.
if people are going to collect cards, should they stay away from cards that are not graded? Because there are a lot of ways cards could be doctored. There's colorization, there's trimming, there's all different things that if you're not a professional, that you wouldn't be able to catch. And of course, any of those type of items makes a card much less valuable. So
Yeah.
if you're collecting for purposes of value and keeping its value, should you
Mm-hmm.
stick to graded cards, and are there a particular grading company or companies that people should be looking towards?
Yeah, I think that anywhere where there's money, anywhere where there's money, there's more of a propensity for fraud, and that really is a thing in this hobby, and especially as people start to people who are not super knowledgeable about the hobby start to want to get their feet wet and get involved. There's very much, this universe where people want to get a great deal. They want to find a great thing, and they'll buy in an unlikely place and think they got something that's too good to be true. It's just like anything else. If it seems like it's too good to be true in this business, it is too good to be true. And so you should really, if you're planning to invest, it's just like investing in anything else. You want to, make the best decision that you can make. You want to choose the best companies that you can choose. If you're investing in the market, or if you're investing in diamonds or timepieces or anything that has value, you want the best. And it should be the same with particularly sports cards. So what you want to do is you want to focus on rarity and condition, and you want to make sure that the pieces that you're buying have been authenticated by the market leaders, not by the fly-by-night companies. So if you see, a card that's been graded by PSA or by SGC, you know that those are the market leaders. That's where you should be staying. Okay. When you start to go from there, now you're talking about, companies that don't have the reputation, they don't have, the
I don't want to put you on
sales.
the spot, but would you?
Yeah.
I don't want to put you on the spot. Do you include Beckett's in that group
So
as a graded company, or is that?
Beckett is an interesting entity because they to a degree, yes, that's the short answer to the question. What you have to be able to do. Beckett is a company that has changed its branding many times over the years. So there's Beckett Vintage, there's Beckett Grading Services, there's all of these different acronyms that are Beckett related. The one thing that they have that becomes very confusing is they have a brand called BCCG. And the BCCG brand was designed specifically for selling into the home shopping channel, right? And they have a 1 to 10 scale just like everybody else, but their 1 to 10 scale means something different than PSA or SGC or any of the other reputable companies. So a lot of people will say I have a Beckett 9, but Beckett BCCG 9 is a completely different thing than PSA 9. A Beckett 6, I think, means it's good or better. So if you buy a Beckett 6, you could submit it to PSA and get a 2. So you have to be really, really careful if you're buying Beckett that you're not buying the BCCG. Um, and that's, I guess that's really the only place where I would caution somebody with Beckett. Beckett doesn't tends to not have the value of PSA or SGC, but I think that's just because there's naturally a greater demand for the market leaders.
And when I know SGC doesn't do this, I believe not, but PSA does. They sometimes will have a card, and they'll put a grade, and next to it they'll put OC off center, or they'll put a miscut MC. How
Yeah,
does that affect the value, and how should a collector look at that kind of? I call it a condition
sure.
of the grade.
Yeah, they PSA calls those qualifiers, and what they're trying to do is tell you that this card would be in near mint condition if it wasn't for the writing on it, or if it wasn't for the fact that the image is way off center. And so for the purposes of I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but for the purposes of their registry, um, the card gets a 2 grade deduction if it has a qualifier. Okay, so a 7 MC has the value of a 5. Okay, and you should consider that when you're buying as well, that you shouldn't be paying a price for a near mint card when it's a 7 MC. You should be paying the price for an excellent condition card when it's a 7 MC. They're doing a lot less qualifiers on their cards these days. They're really just factoring those flaws into the grade, which is really, I think, what they should be doing. That's how it should work.
And let's talk about a change in the industry that I think affects probably younger people is the reason it affected. When there became a time, I'd say in the late '60s, early '70s, the market was flooded with cards, and those cards from the '70s and '80s, frankly, almost became valueless because there were so many different companies
Yeah,
issuing so many cards, and then some card companies went to something else. They tried to attach to a card a piece of a jersey or an autograph of a player or things to make it unique, to make it one of one or one of five or one of six.
right.
And with modern cards, because modern cards really didn't have any value. I mean, I have a 1986 top set that's
Yeah,
probably worth less than than one card I have.
less than you paid for it. Yeah,
So how do you? I don't know if you deal in those type of cards, the modern cards with the different pieces of something of a game,
yeah.
and how do you see that going in the future? Do you think those will hold its value?
So, so I think you can look right at the cards that have come out since they started doing that, right? And you can see some of them have virtually no value. So here's a card with a Yogi Berra jersey swatch, and it's $30. And here's a card with a slice of a Babe Ruth bat, and it's $200. And so we call that manufactured rarity. And I think the best example of this that I can articulate is one day I had a gentleman who came into my office who owned a bar that went out of business, and he had decorated his entire bar with sports prints that were signed by the subject in the print. Okay, and he wanted to sell them because he obviously he didn't have a use for them anymore, and so um, he had a pickup truck that was loaded up with all of these framed pieces, And this one was a print that's signed by Joe DiMaggio, and it's one of 25. And then here's another thing that's a different print of Joe DiMaggio, and it's signed, and it's one of 500. And here's another thing that's a print of Joe DiMaggio, and it's one of 200. And there were probably 10 different things that were Joe DiMaggio signed, but limited edition. And what we had 10 different Joe DiMaggio autographs, which were not at all rare. And so I think that's kind of what happens with those things. I realize that the hobby is very bullish on these one of one and things like that. Um, we call that manufactured rarity. The card company is only making one of these or 20 of these or whatever it is. Um, my company tends to focus on things that are that rare because that's how many survived all of these years. Where there's one known example, there's four known examples of a thing that's 100 years old. It's much less likely that there's going to be some company making another one of 150-year-old baseball card. And so I think you have to be careful when I see people buying these things and spending $1 million. I sort of shake my head and think, especially when they're buying something for $1 million for a guy who hasn't thrown a pitch in the major leagues yet,
Yeah.
I kind of think, okay, it's great to see these folks in the hobby, and to see this thing that I have always considered to be a hobby to suddenly become another class of assets. But at the same time, you have to be careful about where you're putting your money, the same way you would be careful about investing in the market. If you're investing in some startup company that could go belly up tomorrow, it's the same thing where you're investing in a pitcher who's one Tommy John surgery away from or one steroid suspension away, or something even worse, away from never pitching again, never playing again. And so I think the expression is with investing in the vintage hobby, the deader the better. The longer he's been gone, the less chance that's I mean, Babe Ruth's legacy is set, and we know where he stands in the whole business, right? Versus somebody like Shohei Ohtani, who certainly is exciting and great to watch, and shows all of the promise of being that level of player. But how many other players have there been in our lifetimes who have shown that same kind of promise and excitement, and it just didn't work out, right? So in the case of investing, I tend to be a little bit more conservative and think let's stick with the folks who've already shown us what their career is going to be.
I remember when I go to card shows. I really don't go to card shows. I don't. They have card shows now, but I don't. Not as
Yeah,
many people go. I remember dealers used to have. Don't tell me about the cards that your mother threw out,
yeah.
because what happened is, they would throw out the cards, and
Right.
it was different when I was a kid. We used to flip the cards. It was a different
Sure.
type of thing. It was a different, it was a whole different kind of. We didn't think about collecting it, and I know today one of the reasons that usually the first card in a series or the last card is more valuable is that people put rubber bands around them and they get more beat
Yep.
up because they were at the beginning, at the end, and things like people would pay a fortune for a 1952 pack of baseball cards that's never been opened, even though they
Yep.
don't know what's in the card. The fact
Yeah.
that it's never been opened, that get valuable, and it's all the scarcity of the cards.
Yeah.
But let me ask you about something else that I never thought was valuable. I didn't like, but now seems to be becoming more in vogue. I bought some 1952 Bowman cards,
Hmm.
and a lot of them were autographed. And I thought
Yeah.
that decreased the value of the card to have them autographed. And I think for a long time it did. Now it seems to be coming in vogue if you can
Yeah.
actually, you get it graded being authenticated, to the autograph being authenticated, because as we know, There was a time, I think the FBI came out with a statistic that something like 75% of the autographs, sports
Yeah,
autographs out there, were fakes. But I think the hobby has cleaned that up a lot now. But as an autographed baseball card of a old time player, is that have more value because it's autographed, or does it take
it's
away because now there's writing on the card?
it's funny because for ages that was considered taboo. Don't have the player sign a card because you ruin the condition of the
Right,
card. Um,
right.
and then somewhere along the line, somebody realized that because it was taboo for so long, there are not a lot of vintage signed cards, and so um, that has come full circle, and now there is a real demand for signed cards of particularly of players that passed away before the big autograph boom in the 80s and 90s. In the 80s and 90s, it got to the point where a lot of these players made more money signing autographs than they made playing the game that they played. But some of these guys, I mean, the dollars are crazy for vintage signed cards. I remember we had a full set of signed 52 tops. It wasn't a full set. It was about, I don't know, 380 of the 407 cards in that set, and we sold them all individually. And you try and look up each individual player and make sure that you're doing your homework, and um, when people passed away and that sort of thing. One of the players was Connie Marrero, and Connie Marrero died in 2016. So I thought, that's not it's not going to be a major card. Well, the card wound up selling for thousands of dollars. The thing that I didn't realize is that when Connie Marrero was finished with baseball, he went back to Cuba, which is where he came from, and he died in 2016 in Cuba. So finding a signed 52 tops Connie Marrero is a big deal, and the hobby paid big for it. We had other guys like I had one of 52 tops Cliff Fannin. You can buy a 52 tops Cliff Fannin for $10, $20, but as soon as his autograph is on there, it becomes one of only two or three known, and it's sold for thousands of dollars. So it really has come full circle. We just sold a 1949 Bowman autographed Jackie Robinson for $170,000. So it, there's money in this, and so it's definitely. But like anything else, you have to make sure that your autograph has been authenticated by one of the market leaders. You can really get taken with autographs. So you want to look for PSA DNA. You want to look for James Spence authentication, and that's pretty much it. And if your signed item hasn't been authenticated by one of those companies, don't don't buy it. It's just there's too much fraud out there, especially in autographs. One time I had a guy at a trade show one time. It was a dealer that I knew, and he came up to my booth and he grabbed my business card, he flipped it over, and he wrote on the back, uh, "Dear Al, best wishes, Mickey Mantle." And the autograph, he signed it instantly in a second, and it looked exactly like Mickey Mantle's autograph. And that was like, okay, that's how easy it is to do that. So
I hope you didn't resell it. you
no,
didn't.
no,
You didn't sell it.
no. I still
Well,
have it.
send
I
it
use
into
it as an
authentic.
example. Yeah, no, I use it as a cautionary tale all the time. It's you know you have to be really really careful with autographs.
There's an area that I think you're one of the few dealers that I know of that specialize in these type of items, which are the tinnotype, the old photography
Yeah,
pictures. I don't see other dealers who really are into that space.
yeah.
I'm sure there are others, but that seems to be something that's become, I don't want to call it a specialty of yours, but something that you're very proficient in. Can you tell me
We
about that and what why you got into that and the valuations of that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we try and dig into a little bit is that we're real big fans here of things that were not intended to be collected. Okay, so then you start to get into things that were really thrown away: ticket stubs, game programs, photos, and other types of memorabilia items. A lot of my competitors don't like to get involved in those because they're not an easy. Graded cards are easy. You put it up; it's got a grade on it. You throw it in an envelope and you ship it. The things that were designed to be on display in a retail store, they're harder to pack. They're more delicate. You have to be more careful, so it's not as easy to process it and move it. We tend to focus on that kind of stuff because we like it. It's a lot more historically important, and there's nothing more so than, I don't think, than photos, which were, in a lot of cases, they were distributed to news outlets. They were written on, they were trimmed, they were cut up and used for newspapers, and then they were thrown away. And so finding them is very difficult. And a great example of this was just in our most recent auction. You would think, that the first at bat of Jackie Robinson is something that was widely photographed. You would think that something so significant that people knew when it was happening, how important it was. You would think that there were tons of photos of that. We had in our last auction the only known photo of it, of Jackie Robinson's first at bat, and it sold for $50,000. I mean, and the photo was taken from way high up, behind home plate, up in the grandstand, and it was a news service photo, so it's big, 8 by 10 or something like that. But Jackie was just a tiny little, he's small, and
Yeah.
and you almost couldn't tell it was him, except for obvious he was the only person of color on the field, so you knew that it was him. But you know that was the only photo of that, and that tends to be the case with a lot of vintage photos, and the earlier you go, the more rare they get. So we do a lot of 19th century cabinet photos and things like that. Where I'm just fascinated by them. You see, there's a few of them behind me. There's an 1890s Chicago photo, like kind of like there, that one. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
that may be it took me a while to get the that may be the only one that exists of that photo, and so that tends to be, we really like that stuff.
So is there it's an area of collecting I don't know myself. I've never collected in that area, but are there negatives of these photos and then you could just make more copies from the negatives? If you have a
Yes.
negative, I would think that's more valuable. You can make hundreds of copies from the negative. And does
So
that
then
decrease the
it,
value? How does that work?
it's funny, the negatives don't sell for as much as the actual original photos
Really?
because well, you can't display it. You can't display a negative. You can't see what it is, and
Right.
so that makes it less desirable. We've had some great negatives and great slides over the years. They just don't sell for as much. Yes, in theory, you could use those negatives and develop more photos, but today's paper is very different than than vintage paper, and it's very easy to tell when something has been, run off vintage paper versus actual paper. They used to, in about 1950, they started using optical brighteners to make the paper more white, make it brighter, and that's very easy to, it's very easy to detect.
Now, you mentioned an area that I've kind of gotten into collecting a little bit, tickets, vintage tickets.
Uh-huh.
My thinking being, I mean, I'm trying to get ahead of the curve here. My thinking being is that when I go to a baseball game now, I don't get a ticket. I get
Yeah.
a ticket on my phone, and they don't make tickets anymore. There's no
Yeah.
such thing as tickets anymore.
Right.
So I thought in my limited knowledge that this would make tickets more of a rarity, particularly tickets of historic games,
Yeah.
and that the value of those tickets would go up exponentially. Do you think that the the investment value of tickets is going up, or are people looking in other areas to
I
to invest?
I think it goes back to the whole the whole issue of whether or not something was manufactured, when it was manufactured, was it intended to be collected? Okay. Um, modern tickets, and yes, you're right. There, tickets are really not a thing. But like in the '90s, when it was a stadium's last game, they make a commemorative ticket, and it's beautiful, and it's and everybody saved it. So there's 38,000 of them, or however many seats there were, and plus there's ones that there's proofs, and tons of commemorative examples that they made that never even went to the game. But when you get back to a ticket to Ty Cobb's last game, or Babe Ruth's first home run, or Jackie Robinson's first game, or anything like that, you're talking about six-figure pieces. There just weren't a lot that survived. People threw them away, and once the game is over, what's the point? And so there are people who save their stubs. We all know them. I have friends who have pile of tickets from every concert that they ever went to, and it's what triggers the memory of when this is when I saw the Beatles in 1965 or whatever. So those milestone games, I was at Stan Musial's 3,000th hit, or I was at Derek Jeter's first game, or whatever it was. They have maintained value. Tickets to Derek Jeter's first game was a nondescript May game in Seattle, and that ticket is a few $1,000s now. And nobody would have thought in 1995 in May in Seattle that game was an important game. It's only after Derek Jeter's career is in the rearview mirror that we know he was a superstar and one of the greats. And anybody who saved that ticket, is going to do well. And for that reason, ticket collecting is a really interesting piece of the hobby. The other thing that's kind of cool about tickets is tickets prior to say 1960, they really were works of art. They're beautiful, and the tickets of the 1930s were big, and they were printed in multiple colors, and they had all these ornate designs and team logos, which are no longer used. So if you can find them, they're really neat, and they certainly have value.
The tickets, though, I mean, back in the 30s and 40s, you go to the game and they would tear the ticket in half.
Yep.
So you wouldn't have a whole ticket. You'd have, depending on how it was torn, it
Yeah.
would be a different ticket, each one being a little unique. Are tickets valued based on how they're torn for the older
It's
games,
it's
or is it
not
more
as
valuable to have old?
it's not as much of a detriment as you would think. Okay, with tickets, a full ticket has more value than a stub, right? But not as much more value as you would think, because there's a whole contingent of collectors who think that the full ticket isn't as great to collect because it never went to the game, and the stub is the thing that has the most value because it went to the game. And so I knew people 20 years ago in the infancy of this hobby who had full tickets and would tear them in half because two stubs are worth more than one one full ticket. So that's really still the case in a lot of instances, with particularly with milestone games or important games, World Series. And again, when you get pre 1930, they get really tough, and it's not just baseball. There's important football tickets, college rivalry games, are they go back into the 19th century, Harvard Yale games, football games from the late 1800s. There's an unbelievable amount of people who collect those. So it's a really cool piece of the hobby, and I'm glad to see it getting some traction, because it's again, this is a thing that it wasn't intended to be collected, so naturally there are fewer of them.
So I have to ask you this, because I know you're a
Uh-huh.
lifelong Yankee fan. I'm a Mets fan. I still have
Okay.
a soul. I don't go for the world championships.
Oh, wait a
Why?
minute.
Why is Mickey Mantle, who good player, but in terms of all-time great players, I don't think he's in the conversation of all-time great player. why does his card have so much value in the hobby, which I think is above his standing as a player? There are so many players that are better than him. But why does his card, when we talk about a standard of modern cards, his 52 tops card is probably one of the top cards in the hobby of the
Yeah.
modern cards, and his other 51 Bowman is also up there. Why does Mickey Mantle in the sports card collectible business have such value, which I think is outsized to how good a player is? And don't answer as a Yankee fan. Answer as a professional in the sport.
No, I mean, I'm a Yankee fan, but I'm a baseball fan, and I
Right.
agree with you. I think there were things that went beyond baseball, that Mickey Mantle had going for him. Okay, so he was the best player on a team that won multiple World Series in a row at the dawn of television. And I think that had a lot to do with it. When people were just getting televisions, you know, if you think about, I like to say this a lot, but when you're talking about, say, tobacco cards from the early 1900s, players like Ty Cobb, right, Walter Johnson, if you lived in St. Louis, right, it could be that the only way you could even know what Ty Cobb looked like was by getting his baseball card. Okay. And so, somebody buys a pack of cigarettes and it's got a Ty Cobb card in it. And that's the first time you've ever seen Ty Cobb. With Mickey Mantle, it was the other way. You see him on television. He was a celebrity. He was visible. He was on the news. He was being interviewed. There were pictures of him everywhere. And I think that was a big reason why he was so desirable in the the dawn of this hobby, right? The golden age of this hobby in the 1950s. And that just endures. It just stays. But I don't think there's any question that Willie Mays was a significantly better baseball player than Mickey Mantle, and never had that same kind of draw that Mickey Mantle did.
And Hank Aaron and Willie Mays.
Yeah,
I want to thank Al for being a part of this, and you should check out his auctions. If you have any interest in sports collectibles, it's Love of the Game auctions. Al, what's the site? It's just Love of the Games
it's
auction.com.
loveofthegameauctions.com, or you can get there with just lotgauctions.com.
Right. It's important who you do business with. And, he's a very reputable guy. Some people in this industry still are not so reputable, but it's a very
Yeah,
reputable auction house. He's a very reputable guy. And you couldn't do a lot better than working with Al. So
I
thank
appreciate
you,
that.
Al, for being part of it. And thank you all for tuning in to On the Mark. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Howard.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of On the Mark. I started this podcast by quoting John F. Kennedy and would like to end it with quoting one of my favorite baseball players, Nolan Ryan. Enjoying success requires the ability to adapt. Only by being open to change will you have a true opportunity to get the most from your talent. I wish you success in staying ahead of the curve instead of behind the eight ball. Thank you for tuning in.